which will be opening at the Goodman Theater June 1st. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to thank the Arts Incubator, Lee Bay, for inviting us here to have this discussion. This piece, Stop Reset, for me, is about my being at the Goodman Theater for 20 years. Wow. And my relationship with the Goodman for the last 20 years as an artistic associate. Thinking about that, I was wanting to do something that deepens my relationship with the theater, deepens my relationship with Chicago, and I live in Chicago, and this piece is about Chicago. It is about an African-American publisher of books, and he's trying to figure out how to keep his business afloat as ebooks are outselling actual books, and he loves the weight, smell, the feel of actual books. He doesn't know how to adapt in a time where everything's changing so fast, and all we have to do is read the papers or online or step outside to talk to someone, to know how fast things are changing. I'm talking about technology. I'm talking about social change. I'm talking about economic change. I'm talking about racial change. I was online on my Facebook account and reading about Baltimore. And I'm going, what is going on? There are two parts in terms of media. One is a lot of young thugs running the streets and breaking up stuff. And the other one is a community, communities coming together and speaking out about how they feel, how we feel, about what's going on in America today, what's going on in the world today, how we see things, and these different versions of how we see things is what this play speaks on. We look at what's going on today, and depending on who you're talking to, you're standing here, you're standing here, you're standing over there, you're standing here. The ground that we stand on is shifting, and we don't know sometimes where we're supposed to stand. Some people dig in, making it stand, and some people topple headlong into the unknown. What we believe in, some people fight for. What we know, what we believe in, as things are changing. We're forced to make a stand as to how we feel about it. Or is the choice to seek the unknown? That's what this piece is about for me. Stop Reset, this publisher of books who is facing extinction, an endangered species, this man who must question all parts of himself. He must question himself as a man, as a businessman, as a community member, as a father, as a husband. His son is dying, and so he's dealing with his legacy, this business that he's built over. He's 75 years old. Who is he going to pass that on to? Even this love of books. Will books be around in the next 50 years? So this is what he's grappling with on his day. So I was thinking about how I feel about books and where I entered. Being 5 years old on the floor with my mother, her hand on mine, creating children's books. And I think this was the most powerful thing that she ever gave me. Very empowering, this love of creativity, of imagining something, creating something in your mind and making it concrete. My love of books came from that, to be able to step into other people's shoes, to see through their eyes, to expand myself through their experiences and come back to myself. Seeing things in a different way, including myself, to be able to name myself in writing. Books I love. So writing about this was very personal, and I wanted to have then a personal relationship with audiences, to be able to break down the walls of the theater, and to engage with them one-on-one, have a dialogue. And so that's where this piece started growing outside of the walls of the Owen Theater, which is inside of the theater, to bring communities together online and in person. And this is part of that, in person and online at this moment. It is to have conversations with real Chicagoans about their feelings, how they feel about change, what's passed down, legacy, past, where we are right now, and how we move into the future. To have these conversations in dinners, in symposia, and also in collaborating with artists, both professional artists and students around Chicago, so that they could create pieces around the themes of this play. We put all of this, all of these experiences on a site that the Goodman Theater has created to have audiences choose where they enter the play, whether they enter it through the microsite and they see these pieces. Also creating pieces about the characters of the play that will live online, characters that are mentioned in the play that live online. They all live in Chicago. That's where it's set. To have conversations, all of these things are set online. You can enter the microsite before you get to the theater, June 1st. You can enter the site while you're at the theater. You can enter the site and continue this dialogue after you've seen the play. That was the vision of the piece, so I'm very happy that we're sharing this vision today. And so glad to have all of our participants sharing their perspectives on change and legacy tonight. We're going to start with a couple of films. We're going to show a piece of a film by a student, Marina Fenning, called Frozen, and its subject matter is jet editing. The character in the play, Alexander Ames, is 75 years old, trying to find someone to connect to, who he can pass on his legacy to. His son is dying. He is interviewing all of his workers on this day to see whose job will be extinct as he's downsizing, and also to see who he might pass on his business to. All of them are over 40 except for one, and that one, his name is Jay. He's 19 years old, he's semi-literate, he's tech brilliant, he's the janitor. Mr. Ames starts having this conversation with this young man about what the future of books might look like. He talks about what the future might look like, period. He's talking about everything that's happening in the world today and where we might end up. With that, Mr. Ames finds that the young man has interesting ideas about what might happen 500 years from now. Is he a brother from another planet? We don't know, which goes into the sci-fi aspect of it, which goes into the Afrofuturism of it. Who is this young man, 19 years old today? As an African American, who will we be 500 years from now? It's a question that's asked. With that, Mr. Ames finds that the young man is not interested in the past. It's only about the present moment and the future. So Mr. Ames has to try and figure out how to negotiate, to embed himself, negotiate on his own terms with this young man. We have some interesting conversations that are generational conversations and all sorts of conversations. Our next piece is by Messiah Equiano, and I believe he's here today. Thank you so much. This piece is Ames Recollections.
Yeah.
I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mr. Lee Bay, who leads the Community Engagement Planning and Government Affairs efforts for the University of Chicago's Arts and Public Life Initiative with the Astor Gates.
well, actually, two things. I want to welcome you to the Arts Incubator, and because actually I'm on a clock, I have to do this. How many of you, this is your first time here? All right, excellent, welcome. Don't be a stranger. Welcome again. So first, let's have the panel come up and take their seats here. And I introduce them once I'll introduce them now. Walking behind me is Ayana Contreras. She hosts and produces a radio show called Reclaim Soul on Vocal Radio, the sister station of WBEZ. The program features all vinyl soundtrack from our extensive collection, and believe me, it's really worth checking out, so please check it out. Next to her is my good buddy Tracie from the Department of Cultural Affairs, I still call it Cultural Affairs. It's the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. All right, get it right now, get it right. Tracie is the Deputy Commissioner there. Her Arts and Creative Industries Division oversees film, music, fashion, culinary, visual, and performing arts. Prior to joining DK's, her previous experiences and positions have included being Vice President of Strategy and Organization Development at Queens Library in New York City. And so welcome to Tracie as well. Next to hey, applause. Next to Tracie, Mwata Bowden, who was an American Jazz Reeds player associated with the Association for Advancement of Creative Musicians, which has celebrated its 50th anniversary. Celebrating its 50th anniversary. He's an instructor in improvisational jazz at the University of Chicago. He's part of a group known as 8 Bold Souls. He also frequently engages in collaborations with musicians everywhere. So welcome. And next to him is his son, Khari B, disco poet Khari B, a spoken word musician and educator, working internationally as both a performer and an instructor in literary arts. A reputation for delivering powerful performances with intense instrumental accompaniment, Khari B's energetic nature is inextricably tied to growing up in Chicago's house music scene and being the son of 2 educators. So welcome as well. So applause for the panel. Just to give you a sense of what's going to happen over the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to actually obviously have a discussion followed by Q&A. I really want to draw this audience in. I think there's going to be some interesting things we're going to dissect in the time we have together, and really want to turn into a conversation amongst us all. So before we started here today, we kind of did like a round table of sorts with the panelists, and you know, the events in Baltimore, I think, were really weighing heavily on us, particularly all of us, particularly as it relates to the themes of the play. This idea, I'm posing this as a question for us to kind of get into, either way you want to. This idea of, as time passes, of a thing becoming obsolete, having to make the choice of what you keep and what you throw away. And we can frame that in terms of objects, but I think also, and the films kind of showed this, that this question is also germane to the to people. And if what we see, what we're looking at, for better or worse, in Baltimore and other cities, is this sense of a people feeling thrown away, not invested in. The march of time threatens to leave them behind, and what you see, the positive and the negative, to what extent is that a reaction to this thing? We don't invest in an 8-track tape player, we throw it away in this society, is a sad byproduct of this idea that people can be as vulnerable. Oh, y'all quiet now.
It's definitely reactive. As what I said earlier, it's not a new thing. This is, I mean, how is this different than any other reactive uprising that we've done in the last 150 years since slavery was outlawed in this country? It's the same stimulus. It's the same reaction. It's just not, and it's not okay. But I think because it's happened so many times, we're totally desensitized to it. Completely desensitized to it. It's like, another guy got killed. We tear up another city. yeah, we'll be back to work on Monday. It lacks meaning because of the lack of organization. And that's the change that is gonna have to happen for these things to make a difference. Lashing out is one thing, and it's expected. We can be emotional people. Everybody's, I guess, most people are emotional people that will lash out when enough stimulus happens to make us do that. So it's definitely apropos, but at the same time, without organized action, it's a disposable display, because there'll be another one killed tomorrow, without doubt.
So how do we, I mean, to the panel, and again, I don't want to nest here too long, but it just felt like it was a good place to kind of begin. So what do we do? How do we fix the character in the play? Mr. Ames is looking for solutions, and so how do we? What might the solutions be, or should they be? Tracie, Mr. Bowden. Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that society is built on this capitalist thing that means that people have to be at the bottom in order for there to be a top, right? Like, so if you prescribe to this capitalist thing, right, like that means you're prescribing to this bottom, and it just happens to be the bottom is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And the dream of a middle is eroding away, and so you've got, you know, generations of people that were raised thinking that, you know, they could maybe not be rich, but they could thrive, and they're finding out that that's a lie, for the most part, right? So I mean, when you find out that what you've been raised on, the fairy tale you've been raised on, is a lie, right? Then what are you gonna? Well, I mean, what are you gonna do? But be, you know.
One thing I was saying when we were just talking a little bit, and I might, you know, maybe my opinion might be a little bit different, or it might be, you know, really raw. But what I wanted to say, and you know, for full transparency, I'll say this: I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up in Watts, and I grew up right after the Watts riots. My oldest brother, Bruce Moore, was killed in the riots. He was one of the people that was shot by snipers. He happened to be 4 years old, and so. Growing up, my grandparents' house was at 98th and May Avenue. If you know the riots, you know they burned from 103rd Street to 99th. So I grew up playing in empty lots. I grew up finding, I'm gonna be really raw, dead dogs in boxes, because what began to happen is that people began to see that wasteland as a wasteland and began from all the, you know, more empowered neighborhoods to drive all their waste and all their refuse. So I want to say one thing. I think we're at a moment now where we're talking about environmentalism, and there's this trope in sort of the environmental sort of like conversation that people of color are not part of that conversation or are thinking about other kinds of things. And I just want to say that that is completely wrong. If you grew up in the South Bronx, if you grew up in Watts, if you grew up in some parts of Baltimore, then you begin to understand that there is an injustice that's being done against people and the land on which they live. So I think the thing I just wanted to say, Lise, I understand so much of what Khari is saying, because I grew up, you know, my grandmother's neighborhood, and the neighborhood that we spent most of our time. I grew up shopping at the, you know, when we went grocery shopping, we shopped at the corner store, and the stuff was so high priced. It took us to, my grandmother didn't drive, and my grandfather did, but he was a plumber, so he worked all those hours that plumbers worked, and then he cut hair. You know how we have like 15 jobs. So my grandfather had the only car. He had an old truck that he used for hauling. So we were going to do big grocery shopping. We had to wait to be taken. So the thing that I want to say is that, yet I'm a child of the riots, and so there's something to me that we are policed. You know, Khari was making a great point that I agree with. The riots are happening where they are because we are also policed in terms of our mobility. And so I can say a lot more, and hopefully I will, about that. But I guess the thing that I understand is, being a child of the riots, I understand that riots are about desperation. They are about feeling like the place in which you live is not as great as other places. And it is about taking stuff out on that place and the violence that you feel that is happening to you and that place. So I know we can talk more about that, but one of the things that I learned, and as a part of my personality, is to always stand up and to always fight. And I learned that because I grew up where I did at the time that I did.
I want to bring Mwata in on this conversation because we also talked about, in terms of what's lost as time passed, I was reminded of 87th Street when I was a kid in the 70s, and you go down 87th Street, farther south side of Chicago, and see black-owned, real estate places, soft sheen, all those things, and they're largely gone now, and what a wound that was to me. I turned 50 in October. But you talked about a similar thing, a generation earlier or less, in terms of what you remember of 63rd Street and other places on the south side, 55th Street as well, also lost a generation earlier. Talk a little bit about that and how segregation, which we see as a bad thing and certainly had its bad parts, when that fell away, what happened? What was lost?
Then to address that, to go back to something Tracie said, that culturally we are confined in particular areas. And there's a positiveness that comes out of being confined in an area, especially for us as black folks. A lot of creativity comes out of that. A lot of entrepreneurship comes out of that. A lot of internal creativity is created where we invent something, we create something out of nothing. We take our present situations and we find something new in that. And when we are faced with these kinds of upheavals in our community, it not only destroys those physical places, but it also re-energizes the community. When you burn a forest down, right away it starts to rejuvenate itself in a very organic kind of way. And I've seen that happen. I grew up on 47th and Vincennes, right off of King Drive. So I grew up seeing tailors, the shoemaker, hat makers. The doctor lived on the corner, the dentist was upstairs. My community was complete. I didn't have to go anywhere else, but that's that confinement you talked about. I wasn't interested in going downtown, or maybe in the back of my mind because I wasn't allowed to go downtown, or that wasn't a place I would go. But out of that came a lot of creativity and a lot of nurturing of the community in itself. The other part is that because we were confined, we had to do that. So entrepreneurship came out of that, although we were lashing out at things that we were displeased about. And sometimes the forest has to burn in order for that rejuvenation to come back, unfortunately. But it's part of the cycle. And it is us lashing out at things that we need to get rid of and to create something new.
Were you surprised as time passed, how the depth of the loss that would occur?
For me, it changed the landscape completely. I mean, life is never the same before me. It was a nice safety nook to be in. Everything I wanted was right here on the south side. The music, the whole lifestyle. I didn't have to, TV taught me what was happening outside of it. And integration was put upon me as a way of having a part of something that I wasn't a part of, whether I was interested or not. But it seems to be that that's what integration was offering me, whereas I was quite happy in segregation because I found such nourishment in that, but a curiosity about segregation. So I've seen it change, and 47th Street is never the same experience now, because every place I walked up and down there were it was black ownership. I love that. That's what inspired me. I could see musicians walking down 47th Street with horn cases. It was just something that looked special about them. And they always had a nice lady on their arms back there.
It's always special.
I'm growing. Yeah.
So you notice certain things, but it was, again, a short ways from the Regal Theater. I could see what I wanted to be. I could hear those kinds of things in my neighborhood. I saw the doctors and the lawyers. So being contained, as we talked about, Tracie, it has its good elements, and it also has that other side that we need to break and change because of the restrictions that have been put on us.
You know, I want to get into a thing, and Ayana, I want to bring you in on this, is that as we have this sense of loss, there's also, and you're the youngest at the table, I'm guessing, of
I'm 80 years old.
you're 8 years old. There's also the sense of wanting to go back and reclaim things and to bring things and to make sure that they're not forgotten. And the work that you do as a DJ, as a radio host, as a vinyl collector, does it kind of get it? Talk about that.
Well, I think there's this idea that what I do is nostalgic in terms of the vinyl and what have you, but realistically speaking, when I grew up, vinyl was like basically out. If anything, it was cassette tapes. That's what was the thing. But I just remember going through alleys and seeing stacks and stacks and stacks of vinyl records, and I thought to myself, someone took the time to collect these things, and they must mean something to somebody, and I think someday somebody will care about these things. And so I would like be that person who would pull them into like on the back of my bike, or back of the truck, whatever happened. I would take them in. And as I looked at them, the more I saw them, the more I would read them, I would realize how much of it was actually from Chicago. Do you know what I mean? Like, that was something that blew my mind. Because, listening to radio in the 80s, you would not know where you were. You know what I'm saying? Like, it didn't have that feel. But looking at Tyrone Davis records, right? Like, looking at the Impressions, looking at Etta James, whatever. It goes real deep, obviously. But realizing that, like, that's part of our cultural history, just the same as the Sopchin Mansion. Just the same as how the Impressions lived in 3 houses that looked exactly the same on 87th Street. That's adorable, right? Like, they were together. Just all these stories, right? That are important, and I think they need to be shared. And using radio as a format, I think, is ideal because so many of the stories came to me orally, right? So it just makes sense to pass it on that way because that's how they've been living all this time.
Well, what's the lesson there? Because your show is not like an old school oldie show when I was a kid. I mean, when you turn the radio and there's some guy playing. I mean, but yours, it's curated in a way that I find interesting. But there's something that you're saying as you play. Let's talk about that.
Right. So, well, there's 2 things, right? Like when you talk about listening to oldies music, right? Somehow, as time progresses, what people remember are like the big smash hits. But we don't necessarily hear on the radio the songs that meant something to somebody in the basement. Do you know what I'm saying? So when I collect records, literally I'll go to somebody's house and maybe their father passed away and we're going through the records and I'm like, tell me about your father. Tell me about what he listened to and where he listened to it and why he picked this particular record. Or it's really important for me to keep the records together. So it's just as important to listen to the music the way that it was listened to as to rediscover the music and juxtapose it in different ways, right? So there's like a couple of ways in which I play the music. But it's really important to play the music. And I say the music because I also interview a lot of the original cats, the original musicians. And obviously, as Mwata knows, everybody was playing on everything, right? Like Muhal Richard Abrams would play with Eddie Harris on a record, you know what I'm saying? So there was a lot of crossover happening. So I use that term to talk about it regardless of genre. But just it's important to think about the music in a way that's true to our location as opposed to what other people are telling us we're supposed to, you know what I mean? What soul is. If that makes sense. Because what's happening right now, you talk about house music, right? What's happening is it's been reframed as EDM, right? Like there's a new narrative, there's a new origin story that has completely removed all those DJs in the basement in 1980, 81, 82 that were really here creating that. So I want to make sure that narrative of the music stays true.
All right.
I like it. No, I mean, I'm think. I met this cat. Why is his name? Y'all gotta excuse me. I'm coming from a very long weekend. But
Tell us about it.
I'll get to that. What's Bills?
Oh,
Simeon. Now, so I met Simeon at a party. Simeon Vilks plays with a group called Prime Marine. And he's a trumpeter. He's a trumpeter and an MC. And the only reason I talked to him, because we're just kind of sitting in the room, spaced out on our own thing, and he had a case, his trumpet case, and he had a sticker on there, and the sticker said Black Lightning. And our only other place I had seen that sticker was in his top drawer. He got a junk drawer, it's just full of crap. It's just crap at the top, right? Sorry.
Full of crap.
That's memory.
It's organized for him, but it just looks like stuff, right? But I'd seen that sticker in there, and I asked him about it one time, and he played in this funk group in the 70s called Black Lightning. And they had a picture of the big lapels and all the cool suits, and they standing on a hill looking real fly. And I'm like, what is this? Because this ain't no kind of music I've ever heard from him. It interests me. Where you got the music? I don't know where that stuff is. It's all blah blah blah. Whatever. Right. It's all 8 tracks. It's down there somewhere. But you can look at this picture and want to hear the music, and they had, they got a sticker, so they whole marketing team thing behind it. Now here's this sticker on this guy's case that I'm like, where you get this sticker from? He's like, I got it from my dad. He used to play with this group called Black Lightning. I'm like, oh! Right? So we ended up talking across the stories and ended up getting them to talk. Vilts had moved out, the elder Vilts had moved out to Detroit, and we actually got them on the phone and reconnected while we're talking about this music. A couple of years later, Simeon finds somebody had posted one of the records on YouTube. It was the funkiest thing you ever heard in life. He has no recollection of this record happening. I'm like, do you remember such a thing? He was like, what? And what's Simeon's pop's name? Edward, yeah. And so Edward, I ran into him a couple of years ago, and he was like, yeah, your dad wrote all the horn parts. He was the composer on all of this stuff, and he kept us tight. He wrote the stuff down. It's just catching those stories, that narrative, finding that music and seeing the elements in it, seeing the elements that feed into now was phenomenal for me. Not just because I like the music, because I need to find the record itself so I can give it to DJ Big Will and he can play at one of the parties I do, right? But at the same time, because my pops was a part of this. He made this stuff. He don't even interested in funk as far as I know he are, but he wrote it. He did this. And for him, or for me, the way I see it is see his relationship to it is to how we are creatively anyway. We're so adept and used to just coming up with stuff that we don't always hold on to it properly. And somebody else comes in and says, hey, I can reframe this as EDM and make a ton of money on it. House music makes more money than, they do parties in Switzerland and it's 40,000 people and it's 3 dudes just jumping around pushing buttons. And it's killer. It's hard pressed to pay a DJ $200 in Chicago.
Speak for yourself.
And it's the music we came up with, but we're so used to creating and moving on to the next thing. It's just inherent, and we're not the people that put these labels on things. We just play music. We just create and continue on, and then it takes those pink people who come in and say, I can make some money on this. I'm gonna put this label on this. I'm going to market this. And they run off with it and get rich. And then we're sitting around like, wait a minute, I thought that was some stuff I came up with in the 70s.
But that was one of the powerful things about the play is that the brother in the play, Brother Ames, he doesn't want that. He wants to pass this thing on.
He wants to. Yeah.
He understands the risk of what happens, either flat out loss or, if I'm not reading too much into it, others taking the narrative and getting it wrong or whatever. So talk about the importance of passing that off, of being able to hand the baton in a substantial way to a son or a neighbor or a young kid on the block or whatever.
Well, should I?
Yeah.
I can address that then, at least a little bit. As Khari said, that early music was that early period for me, and as a creative artist, I do realize that this music that we play, that I play now, under the heading of jazz, is constantly evolving. Our music is so new, until we can't stand still. We can talk about Western European classical music in 300, 400, 500 year retrospect. When we talk about jazz, our music, the music that was created and invented by African American people, we only have a 100-year retrospect on it. It's still new, yet it has come and evolved itself technically, in terms of the theory and the application in 100 years that it has taken Western European music 300, 400, 500 years to get to. So the music has evolved rapidly, but as a creative person, every day is a new day, because this music, it has to be a living art form. So it's important for me to continue that way. And in terms of passing it on, it was exciting to me then, and it's interesting that 20 years, 25 years later, my son would find something that was exciting for him, and I have long since left that. And looking at a son, I guess it has both. Because I certainly looked and when he started coming into this music, that he would bring some of these new technological elements and ideas into this whole music scene that I wasn't a literate person too. So the teaching process became a full cycle, where I was going to my son for answers on technical matters, and he was coming to me on musical matters of more than 50 years ago, like what was happening then, what was going on, what was the environment then. So the idea of passing it on wasn't really there for me, but it was important for me as an artist that he understood what I was doing, where I was, how I was thinking back then. And coming up in my household, we have 3 kids. It was music everywhere. They couldn't escape it. And consequently, 2 of the 3 have remained in the arts. I mean, actively involved in the arts. So, but they have to make their own choices also. When we try to pass the legacy, or if you're trying to pass the legacy on, you can push too hard. They have to make their own choices. And that came out of my childhood when I was raising kids. My middle son, they came up, they played the music because they wanted to. It was in the house. As a kid, Khari wanted to sit on my lap and hold the horn, not hold it, have me hold it so he could just blow in it. So I could just wiggle my finger. That's all he could do. So he was involved in it, and his mom always had them reading. She's an educator. They had to drawing, art, visual arts. They had to make their Christmas cards, birthday cards, Mother's Day cards. They had to write something in there. That was important to her. So it was a household where yes, they had 2 active parents, and as a result, in our kids, I see the influence of both. So that's become very important for us in raising our kids.
And she played all the soul music.
Yes,
That's how I got
she
it.
did.
She played soul music and rock, like 70s rock stuff. That's where I got that from there. I got that from him, and then there was house music outside. That's how I got into it.
Okay.
That was my musical education.
Okay, Miguel, interesting. Let me bring Sister Tracie into this, because as a deputy in cultural affairs, and the Department of Cultural Affairs especially, I see a shift. I'm a former daily administration refugee, and I had a good time there. So now, I mean, saying a bad word. I had a great time as a deputy chief of urban planning. But there is clearly a shift I've found. I believe I should say. Good approach to culture then. Dare I say, a better approach to culture now. It seems on the city's behalf, it seems like these loose ends and things that may have escaped previously. It seems like that this administration and your work and your colleagues' work is really about preserving and making sure that some of this stuff doesn't leak out or was lost to the edge. You said that preserving a distinctly Chicago culture, particularly musical culture, is important. Is that
I want to answer that really short, but I want to talk about reading because I also
Sure.
want to talk about the book, and I want to ground the conversation
We're
in
gonna
this
get to that.
notion,
We're gonna get to
in
that.
this notion of reading too. I think, but to speak to that, I mean, I think what the panel really represents, I think, is just this idea of art as like cultural memory for me, which is important when you tell the story of going in the alley and finding, really, it's, there's something that is anthropological as well. What were people listening to when? What were people collecting? And I think the reason why I want to talk about the books early is because I think that we also have a history, I think, at least in the African experience, and certainly in the African American experience too, of trying to capture memory and to preserve it and archive it, and that has been going on for so long. We, all of us in the room, if you don't know, the hidden books of in the Sudan, and thinking about books in Timbuktu and the ways in which things were coded and then sort of buried and hidden, and not so that they could become dormant, but so that they could fuel community, and so that you could always go back. And I want to talk a lot about reading, but then also tacit knowledge, because I think that's also what you're talking about here. When Khari, you're very much that young man who sat on your dad's lap and those kinds of things. So I think that when I think about the city, what attracted me, I think, to the position, I'll speak to that, of a stewardship that I think I have now, and that's the way that I describe it, is to begin to sort of unearth those stories from the furthest parts. I always say from Rogers Park to Roseland, because each of our 77 or so neighborhoods is so rich with deep, deep cultural memory and waves of it. Like, long ago migration, recent, migration as well as immigration. There's a lot of stories here, and I think that our job really is to provide a platform for that. Is to provide a platform for artists, and I also think to demystify this notion of what artists do and what art making is, and to talk about something that I talk to my staff about all the time, is cultural work. The cultural work and documenting and all of those other places. You can find culture in our food and the things that we mix together, in the way that we dance. So when we talk about Joffrey Ballet, that's cool, but when we talk about footwork, there's something else that's happening there. Even step, so when we talk about ballet is amazing and it's really cool, and there's a language and vocabulary, a French language and vocabulary around dance. But there is a language and vocabulary around dance in New Orleans. There's a language and vocabulary around dance on the west side of Chicago. There's a language and vocabulary of dance in Compton, California. And so when you see someone dance, you see how they are really sort of in some ways translating experience. And so I think to have that responsibility now, and to begin to think about stewardship of a city called Chicago in a time that is 2015, what does that mean? I certainly hope that it's different than what it was in 2010, in 1975. But the responsibility of that is tremendous, and I think that our work is to not only be eyes and to see that, but also to provide platforms and to validate and to document and to support the people who are trying to do that kind of work.
Ooh, say that.